Uber is going to cease to exist in a few years, and we will tell you why. The company has been facing many financial problems, and that led to the layoffs of 3,000 employees and the closure of 45 offices worldwide in 2020 due to the coronavirus crisis. And these problems caused the price of its stock to drop by 50% in almost 2 years from nearly $60 per share to $30. In other words, if you had invested in them, your investment would now be worth half. How did such a large and recognized company end up in such a critical situation? Why does the price of its shares keep falling? In this video, we will talk about the 4 reasons why Uber could disappear. The first reason is related to Uber's business model, that is, how its founders thought they would make money. Uber is a company that makes money by acting as an intermediary between drivers and passengers. A user simply indicates their location and destination in the app, and a nearby driver can accept the ride and take them. Once the ride is complete, both drivers and passengers rate each other. This idea seems great and revolutionized transportation, but the business model is more sinister than it appears. Uber prefers its drivers to be independent contractors rather than employees, which means they technically don't have to pay drivers a minimum wage or provide benefits. On the other hand, they don't own any of the vehicles and don't cover fuel or maintenance costs, as these expenses are borne by the drivers. However, Uber's way of contracting drivers is illegal in many countries. In San Francisco, where the company started operating, it is illegal. But when Uber was founded in 2009, the San Francisco government hadn't realized how they operated, allowing Uber to grow without proper regulation. Becoming so large had a high cost, and for many years, Uber operated at a loss due to significant expenses in expanding, such as advertising. The money spent exceeded the income. Uber survived on large investments from investors who believed it could monopolize the transportation service industry, eliminating all competition and becoming the sole provider of transportation services. Uber needed to become a monopoly to be highly profitable. Investors continued pouring money into Uber by buying its shares, betting on its ability to monopolize the transportation service industry. Uber's aggressive expansion strategy seemed perfect for a while, making it challenging for a city to ban or regulate its operation. However, this aggressive expansion strategy made many enemies. The first was the local government of San Francisco, which, once aware of Uber violating the law, threatened fines of $5,000 per ride and up to 90 days in jail for its executives if the company continued operating. Despite the government's warnings, Uber continued to operate in the same way, challenging the existing laws. This incident was just the first of many conflicts between the company and governments. Travis Kalanick, one of Uber's co-founders, devised the strategy that allowed for such rapid expansion. Thanks to Kalanick's strategies, the company grew from a small San Francisco startup to a global sensation. The strategy was simple: not paying drivers a salary, not covering vehicle expenses, and spending a lot of money on advertising the app. However, becoming so popular in the transportation industry made Uber's violation of laws more evident. The problem was aggravated by Kalanick's previous history with Scour, a company he founded before Uber, which had to close after being fined billions for copyright infringement. Kalanick never paid that fine, of course, and with that attitude, he demonstrated that he wasn't afraid to break the rules. But besides governments, Uber had gained another enemy: taxi companies, which were not at all happy about competing with Uber. How could they compete with Uber's prices when taxi costs were higher due to law compliance? The entire taxi industry in the United States realized that if they couldn't stop Uber's growth, they would lose customers and money. Faced with pressure from taxi companies, the governments of 15 major US cities had to enact laws that seemed directly aimed at Uber. For example, the government of Rhode Island declared the use of GPS while driving illegal, something essential for any Uber driver. However, this did not stop the company. Uber executives believed they had so much power over the transportation industry that nothing could stop them, not even the government. But there was a problem they couldn't ignore: the lawsuit filed by more than 350,000 drivers in 2013. These drivers sued Uber for the way they were hired and demanded a minimum wage and other benefits as employees. Although this case lasted several years, the company eventually settled the dispute by giving drivers a total of $20 million in 2019. Despite the company losing a significant amount of money in these lawsuits, executives didn't care. All that mattered was their continued expansion worldwide to monopolize the transportation industry. Of course, at this point, Uber was far from being a profitable company. However, this is common for growing technology companies. It is normal for tech companies to incur losses for several years in exchange for user growth, as once they establish a large customer base, the business can become extremely profitable. For example, Amazon operated at losses or minimal gains for years before becoming what it is today, as seen in the chart. However, Uber's case is different because one of the key factors for its success, monopoly, is challenging to achieve. This leads us to the second reason for its downfall. They never managed to obtain a monopoly. Uber's system was the first of its kind, revolutionary, allowing for rapid and extensive expansion. However, the business model is easy to copy, based on an app that other programmers could create. That's why it was crucial for Uber to achieve market monopoly before competitors emerged. But competitors emerged quickly, and in 2012 the company Lyft was created. Today, Lyft is the second largest ride-sharing app in the market, and Uber's main rival. In fact, Lyft has been taking market share from Uber. The chart shows the market share of Uber, Lyft, and other apps between 2015 and 2019, indicating that as Uber lost customers, Lyft gained them. Lyft positioned itself as a friendlier alternative to Uber, focusing on building a better relationship between drivers and passengers. They made user travel statistics as detailed as possible and invested heavily in improving safety for both drivers and passengers, such as background checks for drivers and a mandatory anti-sexual assault training program. But Lyft was not alone. Soon, many apps would compete for Uber's market share, such as Bolt, which focused on markets in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. In recent years, Bolt has expanded to 45 countries and attracted over 100 million customers. Although these companies also face legal issues, their approach to problem-solving is much less aggressive than Uber's. They try to negotiate and coexist with governments by adjusting to legally mandated fares and with taxi services rather than confronting them. Beyond competition, Uber also faced difficulties entering some countries. Being compared to taxi services, Uber has to comply with the same laws. This makes the app illegal in many places. Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Switzerland, and Turkey have partially or completely banned Uber because its way of working is illegal and creates unfair competition with taxi organizations. However, since its competitors are less aggressive in trying to enter a country, there are places where Uber couldn't enter, but other competitors could. For example, in Budapest, Bolt could work normally while Uber was banned. The main consequence of all this competition is that it prevented Uber from achieving a monopoly. But it wasn't just competition ruining the goal of being a monopoly. Everywhere they expanded, they caused disturbances, protests, and violence. This violence gave them a worse reputation, leading us to the third reason for Uber's downfall: bad press among the people. On January 26, 2016, more than 2,000 French taxi drivers protested the presence of Uber in Paris, blocking roads and quickly paralyzing the city center. What began as a peaceful protest quickly turned violent, with over 20 taxi drivers arrested for violent crimes against Uber drivers. It was later revealed that Uber had incited the protests and intentionally caused the violent clashes. Mark McGann, a former Uber lobbyist, sent files containing emails, text messages, and company records to The Guardian in July of this year. The Uber files detailed numerous reckless and negligent decisions coming from the company's top management, with Travis Kalanick's name prominently featured in these documents. In fact, the files contained messages where Kalanick stated that violence ensures success and suggested turning taxi drivers into weapons. Uber's mission had always been to defeat the taxi industry, but these files demonstrated they were willing to do anything to achieve it. The idea was to provoke anger among taxi drivers, leading to violence. Then, the state would penalize them, ultimately benefiting Uber. Furthermore, the protests would generate bad publicity for taxis, swaying public opinion and government support toward Uber. However, this strategy ended up complicating the situation further. Once taxi drivers realized Uber's tactics, violence erupted between taxi drivers and Uber drivers worldwide. For example, in Mexico, Uber drivers were pursued and even killed by the Mexican taxi mafia. Yet executives wouldn't let these violent incidents deter them. Instead, they used such news to portray taxi drivers as simply violent, positioning Uber as the good guy in the narrative. For instance, in early 2015, there were incidents in Amsterdam where masked individuals attacked Uber drivers with hammers, suspected to be taxi drivers. When Uber executives learned about the incident, they strategized on the best way to use these unfortunate events to their advantage. Uber encouraged the victims in these cases to provide copies of their police reports, which were then shared with the press. However, relying solely on public opinion wasn't enough to secure government favor. Like all major corporations, Uber had an army of lobbyists eagerly waiting to put large sums of money into politicians' pockets. As usual, this lobbying was extremely effective, with many countries or cities backtracking on Uber bans. But the cost of lobbying was extremely high. A clear example was when Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, another ride-sharing app, collectively spent over $200 million trying to push through a law benefiting them, known as Proposition 22. The law essentially treated drivers as independent contractors rather than employees. The difference is that as independent contractors, drivers wouldn't have any benefits like vacations, minimum wage, or sick days, but as employees, they would. This would resolve the main legal problem Uber faced in many countries. Despite efforts from various worker rights organizations to prevent this, Proposition 22 was approved in November 2020. However, only a few months later, it was deemed unconstitutional and overturned. This made Uber waste tens of millions of dollars without gaining anything in return. To make matters worse, this happened during the worst time of the pandemic when Uber's ride volume dropped due to lockdowns imposed by countries, as people weren't leaving their homes and consequently, they weren't using the app. But the scandals didn't end there. In 2017, a sexual harassment complaint against several Uber executives became public, leading to their dismissal. The complaint was made by a former Uber engineer, Susan Fowler, through a blog post where she stated that Uber had a toxic culture of harassment and discrimination. Uber responded by investigating the case, and evidence was found that many company executives were complicit, reaching to the top. Kalanick, along with other high-level executives, was implicated and forced to sell all his Uber shares. This led to Travis Kalanick resigning from the company. This was a severe blow to Uber's public image, especially since many people began to distrust Uber drivers. If the company culture was toxic, how could one trust its drivers? Getting into a car with someone affiliated with such a company could be frightening. Despite Kalanick being responsible for Uber's aggressive actions, his departure didn't solve the problems. Last year, London imposed additional regulations against Uber. The new law stipulated that Uber must pay over 70,000 drivers in the United Kingdom a minimum wage, vacations, and pensions. And this time, it had no choice but to comply with the law. This government order was very costly in relation to Uber's business model and would further reduce the profits the company hoped to achieve. This brings us to the fourth and final reason why Uber is in serious trouble. They are not profitable enough. Legal conflicts and issues with how Uber hires its drivers are causing losses, and the pandemic also particularly affected the company due to the drop in transportation demand, as we saw earlier. Despite the company showing some signs of recovery in 2021, the start of 2022 was challenging. Uber managed to achieve a small profit in the second and fourth quarters of 2021, but it still has accumulated losses for many years, and the first quarter of 2022 was the worst in the last 10 quarters. To try to improve the financial situation, Uber increased ride prices. On one hand, this allows Uber to comply with regulations, and on the other hand, it generates higher earnings for drivers. However, drivers are choosing to work with other companies now that there are more applications in the market. This is because being an Uber driver has been unprofitable for some years, with a third of drivers even losing money. This is due to the low ride price and the increased costs of maintaining the vehicle. So despite showing some profitable quarters in 2021, there is still a long way to go for Uber to become financially sustainable, which is why investors are selling their Uber shares and the stock price is dropping, as we saw at the beginning of the video. But despite everything, there might be a glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel for Uber, although it's not an easy road. Most of the company's problems stem from its drivers. But today, technology has advanced so much that autonomous vehicles, that is, self-driving cars, exist. A fleet of autonomous vehicles would allow Uber to solve the problem with drivers, but even this possibility could have its drawbacks. The first is that currently, Uber doesn't have to pay for any vehicle maintenance since all costs are covered by the drivers. In contrast, Uber would have to take on all these costs if it switches to autonomous vehicles. Additionally, Driverless vehicles are a technology that still needs years of work before being genuinely safe, so even if it could be the solution, it won't happen in the short term. But Uber has had many ups and downs regarding autonomous vehicles. First, it invested over $200 million in this technology. However, the research was later suspended when one of Uber's autonomous vehicles hit and killed a pedestrian in 2018. In 2020, Uber would finally sell its autonomous vehicle business for $3.3 billion. But the story of Uber with self-driving vehicles wouldn't end there, as in 2022, Uber and Motional signed a 10-year agreement to offer driverless rides. After more than a decade of legal troubles, violence, and scandals, the company is on the brink of collapse. Only time will tell if they can survive the storm, but without a monopoly, autonomous cars, or massive deregulation, the company's survival seems increasingly unlikely. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment. Also, please consider liking and subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.